I appreciate that as a libertarian I stand within a somewhat different community of opinion from many other people in this room, and for that reason I thank my Lord Sulby and Gregory Lord of Frost and Professor Kersey for their great kindness and tolerance and their commitment to diversity in having invited me here this afternoon to speak to you. For my part, I hope that what I have to say will be of mutual interest to both libertarians and traditionalists. I do not wish you to think that I explain complex social things by a single cause. However, a widespread and profound change in technology will tend to have a widespread and profound change on the way in which individuals deal with each other and in the ways in which individuals and the state deal with each other. And this being the case, the age through which we are now living began sometime around 2 decades ago, sometime between the release of DOS 5 and the release of Windows 95. The information technology revolution has transformed all of our lives. Many of us have grown up knowing only a network world. Those of us who were young when it started and have grown to old age during its progress have trouble imagining a time before the omnipresence of the internet. I was, at the outset of this revolution, what may be called a techno-pessimist. I thought that although there would be collateral advantages to the growth of information technology and to the spread of the internet, I did think that there were substantial costs which would outweigh the benefits. And the most substantial cost that I identified was that the authorities would be able to gather and to make use of so much information about individuals that we would, almost without thinking, find ourselves in a more complete police state than existed in most places during even the 20th century. And if I look at the news, currently in the media, I do see some confirmation of these fears. There is presently a dispute between the British government and the courts over the Data Retention and Investigatory Powers Act 2014, which imposes an obligation on internet service providers and mobile telephone companies to retain data on their customers for up to a year and to make this available on some kind of demand by the authorities. More than this, the government has lately promised a bill which will enable the security services to take remote control of people's computers and mobile telephones. In some cases to plant software on these telephones and personal computers and to turn these devices into bugging equipment for the state. The reason, or the alleged reason, for these innovations? To keep us safe, of course. We are told, not in so many words, but with nods and winks, which it is not hard to decode, that we are threatened by the Muslims. It is 14 years since the terrorist bombings in New York. It is 10 years since the terrorist bombings in London. It is just under 3 years it's just over 2 years, forgive me, since the murder of Lee Rigby in Woolwich. It is 8 months since the Charlie Hebdo massacre in Paris. We are surely under threat. And surely, since we are under threat, you need to be a starry-eyed libertarian to object to entirely reasonable and proportionate measures to keep us safe from these villainous people. Now, I do agree that there are circumstances in which what is undesirable becomes essential. There are times when you should set aside a strict regard for the proprieties in order to save the overall system within which those proprieties have meaning. However, I simply do not believe that that time is upon us. In the first place, I deny that we are under any special threat from the Muslims or the followers of radical Islam, or whatever we want to call them. Between 1969 and 2001, give or take a few years, Sinn Féin IRA mounted a sustained insurrection in Ulster, which often spilled into the mainland. And during that insurrection, over 3,500 people were killed. Sinn Féin IRA did this in order to detach part of the United Kingdom. And if they had succeeded, we can be quite sure that they would have carried out in that former part of the United Kingdom the same religious and ethnic cleansing that was carried out in the Republic of Ireland during the 1920s. And yet, despite this threat, despite what some people would call this existential threat to the United Kingdom, the authorities responded by infiltrating and disrupting the active units of Sinn Féin IRA, by enforcing the law, and otherwise waiting for these people to run out of energy. And by and large, this strategy was successful. If the British government abruptly surrendered in 1997, that is not because Sinn Féin IRA had worn us down. It was simply because of some ideological, or rather some party political shift in the balance of the British state. And since we did not choose to fight this existential threat from Sinn Féin IRA with universal surveillance, I really see no reason why we should worry too much about Islam. Let us face it, there have been substantial and growing Islamic communities in this country for over 60 years. In this time, not more than 24 people have been killed as a result of Islamic terrorism. Doubtless the murders that have taken place have been rather high profile, but not more than 24. I accept that there are other problems with immigration, and there are specific problems with the presence of large and unassimilable Islamic communities in this country. But terrorism is not among those problems. Most Muslims have no territorial demands on the United Kingdom. Most of them do not really believe that they are part of our national life. Most of them have more interest in the affairs of their ultimate homelands than in the affairs of the United Kingdom. Their religious authorities have been more forthright in their condemnation of terrorism than I ever recall the Irish Roman Catholic hierarchy ever was of terrorism. Doubtless, you will have heard Anjan Chowdhury and his friends boasting that one day they will convert England to Islam. You may regard that as a sinister threat, or, more realistically, you can regard it as intention that they wish to do us a considerable favour as they see it. I do not see any threat from these people, nor do I see that the means chosen to deal with the alleged threat will in fact deal with it. I do not know of any terrorists who have planned their attacks by sending emails in English through BT Internet. Rather than employ people to trawl through the 2 billion emails sent every day in the United Kingdom, it strikes me as a better approach to such difficulties as may exist to use the same approach as we used with Sinn Féin IRA. That is to identify the actual and probable troublemakers, to infiltrate them, to understand them, to disrupt them, and where necessary to arrest and to punish them. I do not see that any degree of universal surveillance will be a substitute for that. Indeed, even with the latest scheme announced by the government of allowing the security services to plant software on our electronic devices, I do not believe that any of the means actually available or potentially available in the near future will save us from such terrorist threats as may exist. Of course, failings in the scheme of universal surveillance announced by the authorities will be met with the usual mantra of there will be a full and fair inquiry and lessons will be learned. From that, you can gather that they will spend more of the taxpayers' money in data mining software, and when that proves to be insufficient, they will insist on incorporating into the databases and security services the information in all other public and private databases. And I accept that they will eventually, if they keep spending enough of the taxpayers' money, and if they keep pushing the software developers in the right direction, provide us with the same degree of security from terrorist attack as they could already by using the more traditional work methods that are known to work. But of course, long before that point is reached, the country will have become a police state. Now, I accept that when I talk of this country as a police state, I may sound alarmist. We have no secret police in this country. We have no formal censorship of the media. We have no concentration camps. Nobody is shot to the back of the head. Children are not given medals for denouncing their parents to the authorities. If you define a police state by its more extreme and 20th century manifestations, then it is undeniable that Britain is not a police state. This being said, a police state should be seen as more about control than about any particular mode of enforcement. There are many reasons why a police state comes into being. One of them, I suppose, is the desire of a ruling class to rob and oppress beyond what is thought reasonable by the people. Another is the desire of a ruling class to impose a set of utopian fantasies not shared by the people at large. But in establishing a scheme of control, the actual mode of enforcement of that control depends on local circumstances. There are very few sadists and outright lunatics in any government. I grant that there is probably a higher proportion of sadists and outright lunatics in government than among the people at large, but by and large, most of the people in authority at any one time are not sadists and are not outright lunatics. If the Bolsheviks and the Jacobins, it's even the Bolsheviks, if the Jacobins and the Bolsheviks censored the press and burned books and arrested people and held them without trial and executed them without trial, and if they turned their countries into nightmare states, that was not, on the whole, because they wanted people to be unhappy. It is simply because murdering people and threatening the survivors with murder was the only means they had at hand to get their way. The communist rulers of East Germany and Czechoslovakia were not noticeably nicer men than their Soviet counterparts, but they murdered an insignificant fraction of the numbers murdered by the Soviet communists because they inherited states with a more developed means of bureaucratic surveillance than the Tsars had left to the Soviet communists. They didn't need to murder people because they had other means of getting their way. Oh, they still needed censorship, they still needed prison camps, they still needed corrupt systems of law. And yes, they were embarrassed by this. They made sure to keep their secret police very secret, and they spent a lot of time finding euphemisms for imprisonment without trial, and concentration camps, and censorship and murder. But because they had more developed bureaucratic states than the Soviet communists had, they could afford to be less brutal in their means of enforcing their will upon the people. Our own middle class in this country, and in much of the West in general, can afford to be still more gentle. We do not need a Stasi in this country. We do not need a formal scheme of state censorship. We do not need to burn books. We do not need to arrest people and hold them without trial. We do not need to put them in labour camps. We certainly do not need to murder them. The British police state, to which we are rapidly advancing, or in which we may already be living, is no less determined than any other police state to have its way and to enforce its utopian fantasies upon us. It just does not need to be quite so brutal in its mode of enforcement as the 20th century police states. The reason for this is that to be watched is to be controlled. Most people do not have much of a backbone. And most people, if they know that they are being watched, and that what is watched is being recorded and may be used against them at some point in the future, will change their behaviour. For example, you may like to pick your nose. You may quite often choose not to wash your hands after using the toilet. But if you know you are being filmed, will you pick your nose in a bus shelter? And if you know you are being filmed, will you not make sure to wash your hands after using a public toilet? In most cases, the answer is yes. And it is the same in large things as in little things. You do not need to have a law against buying a bottle of whiskey a day. You do not need to have laws against buying 300 cigarettes a week. You do not need to have laws against downloading and storing adult pornographic images. You do not need to have a law against attending a conference of the traditional Britain group. And yet we are sensibly moving into a world in which increasing numbers of people will avoid doing these things because they are frightened that there might be difficulties at some time in the future because the particular choices they make will be recorded and may count against them in their future dealings with the authorities. And this is even without the government's threatened extreme disruption orders, even without Mr. Cameron's talk of how it's no longer enough for you to obey the law, you must now obey us as well. Even without that, there is that threat. And the danger, so far as both libertarians and traditionalists are concerned, is that surveillance, universal surveillance, will, in the short term, make many people unhappy, but will, in the long term, produce a new kind of person. Somebody to whom it is second nature to conform. We are free-range citizens. We were born, and most of us grew up, in an age before the present order of things came into being. And we chafe against the restrictions, we speak out against them, we complain about them. In some cases, we break the restrictions when we think we can get away with it. But the generation now under the age of 10, and certainly the generation which will be born in 10 years' time, may not be so free-range as we have been. They may be brought up from the cradle in a fixed spirit of obedience to the authorities. They will not feel threatened by the authorities. No, they will not need to feel threatened by the authorities. They will, from their earliest childhood, be inculcated with the duty of prompt and willing obedience, not only to what the authorities demand, but to what the authorities might, at some point in the future, request. And so that is the danger of the information technology revolution, that allows the accumulation and storage and retrieval and use of information on a scale that Stalin's secret police and Hitler's secret police and the secret police of every police state that ever existed before our own would barely have dreamed possible. That is my techno-pessimist nightmare. On the other hand, I had this nightmare 20, maybe 25 years ago, and I really did not accept, I really did not imagine at the time the scale of the compensating benefits that we would derive from the information technology revolution. Let us face it, ladies and gentlemen, the authorities in one way or another have always been able to keep tabs on the population. They've always been able to find out in some way what we're up to, and they've always been able to talk to each other in ways that allow them to stop us from doing things they don't want us to do. Information technology allows them to do this more efficiently and without too much overt force. But it is the nature of rulers to rule. What the information technology revolution has made possible, on the other hand, is for people like us to hit back. The reason why there are so many people in this room is because the Traditional Britain Group has been able to send out notifications of this conference through the internet and through Facebook. If I turn around, I notice that the Traditional Britain Group has an email address, it has a Facebook group, and it has a Twitter account, and a website. And the videos being shot of these speeches will be published on the internet and will be watched by many multiples of the number of people gathered here in this room today. The information technology revolution has enormously increased our ability to organise and our ability to put our message across. I am old enough to remember the early days of the Libertarian Alliance, where we would gather together, all 15 of us, Robert Carnahan may remember it as well, where all 15 of us would gather in a dusty room in Conway Hall to be addressed by David McDonough or David Randy Steele or Chris Taine on some issue of interest to the other 14 people in the room. and where we might sometimes be able to use a Romeo duplicator. Remember those? The only way to avoid getting ink all over your clothes when using a Romeo duplicator is to do the job naked. Those days are past. We have television stations, we have radio stations, we have online journals. If the enemy wishes to single anyone out and say, John Smith is a Satanist, a cannibal, and a paedophile, therefore everyone should have nothing to do with him, it simply means that the people who read those claims go and look on John Smith's webpage and decide for themselves. That is a considerable improvement on what some of us experienced in the 1980s and 1990s. And so there is a threat. I've outlined what that threat is. The threat of universal surveillance is that it will, without any of the overt tools of oppression, create the human equivalent of a battery hen farm. On the other hand, the information technology revolution has opened the means of resistance to that. And because we had no real means of resistance beforehand, I think on balance that we have gained more from the information technology revolution than the authorities have. Above all, I'll close with this. Above all, if you wish to be a dissident against the current order of things in this country, you do not need to run the kind of risk that dissidents in the Soviet bloc faced. A dissident in the Soviet bloc at any time before 1990 really was the equivalent of a Christian martyr during the Diocletian persecution in the Roman Empire. There was a serious risk, not only that you would be put in prison, but you would be somehow killed. None of us faced that risk. We are oppressed by surveillance cameras and the chance of a brown envelope in the post. And if we want to stand up and to resist that growing tyranny, all we need to do is to stand up and behave like English men and women, and not like leftist Guardian reading girly men.